We're throwing it all the way back to the 1600s to talk about our girl Elizabeth, who was granted the title of the most prolific female slayer by Guinness World Records. She's also recognized as one of the very first vampires in the history of ever. So what exactly did this chick do to earn such dramatic titles? Apparently she stuffed over 650 young women and bathed in their fluid to stay young, among a bunch of other really terrible things. Since Elizabeth's status is one of the most important elements to this story, let's start there. Elizabeth was born in Hungary in 1560. She was gorgeous, rich, smart, and ranked high on the social totem pole as a member of the Bathory family, who controlled Transylvania. Elizabeth grew up in a castle, that sounds cool, where she was literally and figuratively fed with a silver spoon. When she was 11 or 12, she was already engaged, or in the 1500s terms, betrothed to a man named Ferenc Nerasti, who also came from a wealthy Hungarian family. Sometime between getting engaged and married, it is rumored that Elizabeth had an illegitimate child. While horseplaying with a peasant boy, she gave birth in a remote estate and gave the kid to some other family. In 1575, Elizabeth and Ferenc officially got married. She was 15 years old at the time. And even though Ferenc was from a rich and powerful family, Elizabeth still outranked him, so she kept her last name, and her husband even took her last name too. As a wedding gift, Ferenc gave Elizabeth his household, Chete Castle. He gave her a literal castle. But 2 years into the marriage, Ferenc became the chief commander of the Hungarian troops. His position demanded him to be away from home for extended periods of time. You know, like off fighting some Ottoman Turks, just typical husband stuff. But that meant Elizabeth was left at home to oversee the happenings at the castle. And Elizabeth and Ferenc ruled over a bunch of castles, manors, and palaces in Vienna, Prague, as well as a few other cities. So Elizabeth, who was just a teenager, was left in charge of all these places and the servants and peasants that lived and worked inside. Nowadays, what people do in their homes is pretty much their own business, as long as they're not hurting anyone, of course. But back then in Hungary, someone with as much power as Elizabeth could do whatever the that she wanted, including whacking their servants. So that's just what Elizabeth would do. Well, not before torturing them excessively. So at some point near the beginning of their marriage, Elizabeth had Ferenc build her a torture chamber. Oh boy. Ferenc, who did whatever Elizabeth wanted, was like, for sure, I'll definitely build this room for you, so you're able to hurt any innocent person. Now I gotta go off and fight the Turks, so ta-ta for now. And when Ferenc was away, Elizabeth started to prey on her servants. She apparently had a bunch of affairs too. Now, the account of all of her torture sessions and slayings is hard to conclude. No one really knew what was going down in this castle, so when people started to speculate about Elizabeth, she had already done so many awful things to way too many people. During all of this, Ferenc was coming and going from the castle and the war grounds. When he was at home, Elizabeth was able to learn all of his battlefield torture techniques. How did that come about?
Hey honey, can you show me what you did to the Turks?
Yeah, why not? Well, actually, it's believed that Ferenc knew what Elizabeth was doing, especially since he helped construct her dungeon. Now, another thing that would happen when Ferenc would come home is he and Elizabeth would try for kids. This woman does not need kids. In 1585, Elizabeth gave birth to her first or second child, depending on what you believe. But either way, this was her first reported kid with Ferenc. It was a little girl named Anna. Now, over the course of the next 13 years, Elizabeth had 4 other children that we know of, but 2 of them passed away when they were babies, which honestly makes me wonder if Elizabeth had anything to do with that. Sometime around 1601, Ferenc started to experience some serious health issues, and within 2 years, it got so bad that Ferenc wasn't able to do much of anything anymore. In January of 1604, he passed away, and he was only 48 years old, but he had been married to Elizabeth for 29 years. After his passing, Elizabeth took over all of her and her husband's estates and became exponentially more dangerous and demented. During this time, Elizabeth also started to prey on other victims. Yeah, she used to just go after peasant girls who worked at her castle, but now she decided to expand her repertoire to include minor noblewomen who were sent to her castle by local gentry families to learn manners. Really? I guess these people seriously had no idea what this woman was doing there. To help lure in victims, Elizabeth recruited one of her nurses, a local witch, a male servant, and I'm sure a few other people. They'd basically scout out young women to bring to the castle, and Elizabeth was a royal countess, so it probably wasn't very hard to get these girls in. I'm also guessing the main reason her crew was so down to help was because they didn't want to become Elizabeth's next victims. Over the years, hundreds of girls just vanished without a trace, and there wasn't really anything comparable to the investigation teams and police force most countries have today. The royal families just ruled the land and made all the decisions, so Elizabeth was at the top of the social ladder, and she just got away with murder. It is believed that Elizabeth snuffed around 650 people within a 35-year period. 650 people! That blows my mind. How did no one notice the sheer volume of number of young women disappearing? Like, you're telling me this went on for decades and no one noticed a thing? Well, that was the case for a long time, but in 1610, Elizabeth was eventually caught. And here's how it all went down. When Elizabeth started to prey on the daughters of minor noble families, everything began to unravel. This is because parents would send their girls off to Elizabeth's castle and they'd disappear. When the parents would ask what happened to their daughters, Elizabeth would just make up the most ridiculous lies like, one of the girls caught your daughter stealing jewels, so she iced her. Sorry for your loss. She probably didn't even apologize, but the parents didn't leave it at that. Some of them requested for their children's remains, but again, Elizabeth would lie, saying they had already been buried in an unmarked grave. It is said that the main reason Elizabeth was outed was due to the fact that these higher class families started to speak up. Sometime before 1610, a Lutheran minister found out, or at least speculated about Elizabeth's sadistic acts. He went to Hungarian authorities to rat her out, but it took years before they took action. In March of 1610, the King of Hungary assigned a palatine, which is a high-level official, to send 2 notaries to collect evidence against Elizabeth. That October, the notaries had 52 witness statements, and within the next year, that number rose to 300 plus. Now, in December of 1610, officials raided Elizabeth's castle, where they found a bunch of dismembered bodies in the tower, basement, and courtyard. When searchers busted into Elizabeth's chambers, some reports say that she was sitting on a stool, gnawing on one of her victims. What the f? Finally, after way too many years of Elizabeth getting away with the unthinkable, it was time to get her ass to be arrested. Officials arrested Elizabeth as well as 4 of her servants who worked as her accomplices. They were all tried in court for 80 counts of homicide, but here's where things get tricky. Most of the witnesses who testified said they heard about what Elizabeth was doing through other people. They didn't directly see her torment any of these people. Now, once all of this was brought to light, it was almost as if all of these people who accused Elizabeth just chickened out. It seemed like the claims were based solely on rumors and there was no evidence to back anything up. There weren't even formal complaints submitted about Elizabeth before the trial. The servants who were tried confessed under torture, but it's not clear if they confessed out of honesty or panic. But keep in mind that all of the information about this case is a little unclear because of how old it is and how much the royal family tried to cover it up. Her trial was actually held in a remote Slovakian town, so it really is a miracle we even know as much as we do know about her story. There were no official reports or newspaper articles about any of this, but even still, it is confirmed that Elizabeth and all of her 4 other servants were found guilty. Some reports say 3 of the accomplices were executed and 1 of them was sentenced to life in prison. As for Elizabeth, her sentencing wasn't so easy to decide. The Palatine discussed the matter with Elizabeth's son and 2 sons-in-law. They all thought that an execution would be the scandal of the century since she was royalty. If Elizabeth received a fatal sentence, her family would be disgraced and all of her property would be seized. How does that matter? Obviously, Elizabeth's family can't control her actions, but they could at least address them and punish her accordingly. All this tea was bound to come out sooner or later. The group who was discussing Elizabeth's fate first thought she should be sent to a convent, but word began to spread about Elizabeth's doing, so instead, they made the call to keep her under the house arrest for the rest of her life. She was confined to a castle apartment where she was fed meals through a small little door. In 1614, she signed her arrangement, which left all of her property, belonging, and inheritance to her kids. And one August night that same year, Elizabeth told her bodyguard that her hands were cold. He said, "It's nothing, mistress, just go lay down." Well, Elizabeth followed her bodyguard's instructions and went to sleep that evening to never wake up again. Elizabeth passed away after about 3 years in confinement. She was 54 years old. The Countess was buried in the castle's church, but some reports say her body was moved because villagers were pissed she was going to be buried in their cemetery with everyone else. It is said that Elizabeth's remains were moved to her birth home, but as of today, no one really knows where she ended up. And now, it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty. Why would Elizabeth commit such heinous crimes? Now, apparently she believed that the vital fluid of young girls would keep her looking young and healthy. And how crazy is that? Elizabeth legit thought that youngins and drinking their was a secret to eternal youth. That's why a lot of people called her a vampire. This woman was so set on this theory because she experienced a tightening of her skin after using the fluid of one of her servants, so I guess she just got a little carried away. And that is the story of Elizabeth Bathory. It's gruesome, disgusting, and just downright terrible. As much as I love a boss lady, this girl took advantage of her status, and that is something I can't get behind.